The day I met Sarah was etched in my memory, though I sometimes wish it wasn't. It was a cool autumn morning, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air as I stepped into a cozy, unassuming cafe on the corner of Main Street. I wasn't looking for anything in particular that day, just a quiet spot to unwind, nurse a cup of coffee, and think. But there she was, seated by the window, her auburn hair catching the soft light streaming through the glass. I remember hesitating for a moment, unsure whether to approach. She had an aura about her, confident yet approachable, a mixture of elegance and warmth. She was scribbling something in a notebook, completely engrossed. Normally, I would have looked for another seat, but something about her made me step forward. "Is this seat taken?" I asked, my voice steady, though my pulse quickened. She looked up, startled at first, but then smiled. "Not at all," she said, gesturing to the chair opposite her. That smile, it was radiant, the kind that could make a man forget his worries. We began talking, and to my surprise, the conversation flowed effortlessly. She told me she was a marketing consultant with a passion for photography. I shared my work as a software developer and my love for creating order out of chaos. She laughed at my dry humor, and her laugh, it was infectious. The cafe buzzed with life around us, but for those 2 hours, it felt like we were in our own little bubble. I remember thinking how rare it was to find someone who made me feel both excited and at ease. By the time we left, exchanging numbers seemed as natural as breathing. Over the next few months, we became inseparable. Late-night phone calls turned into long weekends spent exploring the city, trying new restaurants, and planning a future together. Sarah had a way of making life feel exciting, like every day held the promise of something new. When I introduced her to my friends, they all raved about how perfect we seemed together. "You've hit the jackpot," my buddy Mark said one night over drinks, and I believed him. But looking back, there were small signs I ignored. Her charm, though captivating, often felt rehearsed. She loved being the center of attention and thrived on praise, whether it was from me, my friends, or even strangers. At the time, I chalked it up to her magnetic personality. Now, I wonder if it was something else entirely, a need to control the narrative. Our relationship moved quickly, and before I knew it, we were married in a beautiful ceremony surrounded by family and friends. I stood at the altar, watching her walk down the aisle in a flowing white dress, her eyes locked on mine. In that moment, I felt like the luckiest man alive. But the thing about fairy tales is that they often come with hidden thorns. If I had known then what I know now, that the woman who captivated me in that little cafe would one day be the source of my greatest heartbreak, I might have chosen a different seat that day. Instead, I sat across from her, believing in the possibility of forever. Little did I know, I had just taken the first step into a life where love would soon be eclipsed by betrayal, and trust would become a distant memory. Marriage wasn't just a union between Sarah and me. It came with an entire family dynamic that I quickly learned to navigate, or rather, endure. From the moment I met Gloria, Sarah's mother, I knew I was stepping into a world I wasn't prepared for. Gloria was a force of nature, an imposing woman in her early 60s who carried herself with an air of authority that demanded attention. She was immaculately dressed, her jewelry sparkling under the light, and her sharp eyes seemed to dissect every inch of me the first time Sarah introduced us. "So, you're the one Sarah keeps talking about," Gloria said, her voice dripping with condescension. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. "Yes, ma'am," I replied, extending my hand. She looked at it for a beat too long before shaking it lightly, as though touching me might tarnish her. That first meeting set the tone for our relationship. Gloria was the lioness of her pride, fiercely protective of Sarah, but in a way that felt more controlling than loving. She had opinions about everything: my career, our future home, even the way I dressed. "A man's suit should reflect his ambition," she remarked at one family dinner, glancing pointedly at my slightly wrinkled blazer. Sarah, to her credit, tried to mediate. "Mom, please don't start," she'd say, but her voice always lacked conviction. Gloria's presence was overpowering, and I quickly realized that Sarah often bent to her mother's will, even when she didn't agree. The real clash came when Gloria demanded a prenuptial agreement. It's just a precaution, she said, waving her hand dismissively as though the conversation was trivial. You never know what might happen in the future. I felt my stomach twist in anger. Gloria made it clear that she didn't trust me, and she didn't even bother hiding it. Sarah, caught in the middle, tried to justify it. It's not personal, she said, her tone pleading. She's just being cautious. But it was personal. It felt like Gloria was questioning my integrity, my ability to provide, and my love for Sarah, all in one fell swoop. Reluctantly, I agreed to the prenup, but I added one condition of my own. If infidelity occurred, the cheater would owe the other $50,000. Gloria raised an eyebrow at my stipulation, but didn't object. Sarah, however, seemed hurt. It won't come to that, she said softly, her hand resting on mine. You know I'd never do that to you. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But something about the whole situation left a bitter taste in my mouth. Gloria's constant meddling, combined with Sarah's reluctance to stand up to her, made me uneasy. Still, I convinced myself that love could conquer all. Over the next few months, I became acutely aware of Gloria's influence over Sarah. Whenever Sarah and I discussed important decisions, buying a house, planning vacations, or even starting a family, she would always defer to her mother's opinion. Let me check with Mom, she'd say, as though Gloria's approval was the final word. One night, after a particularly heated argument about finances, I asked Sarah, why does your mother have to be involved in everything we do? She just wants what's best for us, Sarah replied, her voice defensive. She's been through so much, and she knows what she's talking about. But I wasn't convinced. Gloria's advice always seemed to come with strings attached, designed to keep Sarah under her thumb and me on edge. As the months turned into years, Gloria's presence loomed large over our marriage. Her unannounced visits became routine, and her backhanded comments chipped away at my patience. Sarah, darling, don't waste your youth waiting for him to get his act together, she'd say, as though I wasn't standing right there. I often wondered how much of Sarah's behavior was influenced by her mother. Was she truly happy with me? Or was she just going through the motions, trying to appease Gloria? The questions gnawed at me, but I pushed them aside, telling myself that every marriage had its challenges. Looking back, I see now that Gloria wasn't just a lioness protecting her cub. She was a predator circling her prey, waiting for the right moment to strike. And Sarah, whether she realized it or not, was following in her mother's footsteps. For a while, it seemed like life was settling into a predictable rhythm. Sarah and I found our moments of peace amidst the chaos that Gloria so often brought. There were lazy Sunday mornings where we'd lounge in our small but cozy living room, sipping coffee and planning for the week ahead. We shared laughter over bad rom-coms and dreamt about vacations we never got around to taking. Those fleeting moments of normalcy kept me grounded, made me believe that, despite everything, our marriage was worth fighting for. But even in the calm, there were cracks beneath the surface. Gloria's interference was a constant shadow over our lives. She would pop in unannounced, her sharp eyes immediately scanning the house for something to criticize. Sarah, darling, the curtains look so dated. You really should convince David to replace them, she'd say. Or, why haven't you upgraded the kitchen yet? A woman deserves better. Each comment was like a needle poking at my pride. Sarah often brushed them off, but her silence during these moments spoke volumes. She didn't defend me or our choices. Instead, she seemed caught in a tug-of-war between her mother's expectations and her role as my wife. Why do you let her talk to me like that? I asked Sarah one evening after Gloria had left. She doesn't mean anything by it, Sarah replied, avoiding my gaze. That's just how she is. But this is our life, Sarah, not hers. When is that going to matter to you? She sighed, as if tired of having the same conversation. You're overreacting, David. Mom just wants what's best for us. Her words stung. It felt like I was constantly fighting a battle where the opponent wasn't just Gloria, but Sarah's unwavering loyalty to her. As the months passed, the tension between us became harder to ignore. Sarah started to withdraw in subtle ways, canceling plans we had made, spending more time with her mother, and dodging conversations about our future. I'm just busy, she'd say, or, I need some space to think. It wasn't just her actions, though. It was the way she looked at me, like I was a placeholder, someone she tolerated rather than cherished. I convinced myself it was a phase, that every marriage went through rough patches. But then came the unannounced visits from Gloria, each one escalating the tension. One day, she walked in carrying brochures for luxury homes in the area. "You know, Sarah, you could do so much better than this," she said, waving her hand dismissively at our home. "A woman like you deserves something grander, more fitting of your potential." I clenched my fists under the table, biting back a sharp retort. "This is our home, Gloria," I said as calmly as I could manage. Gloria ignored me, turning to Sarah. "Have you thought about the place I mentioned? It's perfect for you." Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but didn't say anything. That silence hurt more than Gloria's words ever could. Even the small joys of our marriage began to feel hollow. The dinners we cooked together were marked by awkward silences. The laughter we once shared seemed forced. I tried to bring us back to what we had, planned date nights, surprised her with flowers, even suggested a weekend getaway. But every effort was met with indifference. "I'm just tired, David," she'd say, brushing me off. I started to wonder if Sarah was simply too far gone, her loyalty to Gloria outweighing whatever love we once shared. The woman I fell in love with was still there, but she felt unreachable, as if Gloria's influence had built an impenetrable wall between us. I began to retreat into myself, focusing more on work and less on trying to salvage what felt increasingly unsalvageable. I told myself that if I gave her space, she'd come back to me. But deep down, I knew I was just avoiding the inevitable confrontation. One night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, Sarah turned to me and said, "Do you ever think about what life could have been like if things were different?" Her words sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to ask her what she meant, to demand answers, but fear held me back. Instead, I mumbled something noncommittal and pretended to fall asleep. That was the moment I realized the storm was coming. The calm we were living in wasn't peace. It was the quiet before everything fell apart. The calm before the storm began to unravel when Sarah's behavior shifted from distant to outright suspicious. At first, it was small things. Her late nights stretched longer, and her explanations felt rehearsed. "Just catching up with friends," she'd say with a casual shrug when I asked why she came home hours after dinner. But her tone was too light, too practiced, and it made my stomach twist every time. Then came the phone calls. I'd hear her voice muffled behind closed doors, her laugh unnatural, almost forced. Whenever I asked who she'd been talking to, she'd wave me off with a dismissive, "Oh, just mom checking in." But the unease grew, gnawing at me like an itch I couldn't scratch. One evening, Sarah walked through the door holding shopping bags filled with high-end designer clothing. She was beaming, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Guess what?" she said, setting the bags on the couch. "I found this amazing boutique downtown. Everything was on sale." I raised an eyebrow, glancing at the tags that peeked out from one of the bags. The prices were astronomical, hardly on sale. "Looks like you went all out," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "It's just a little splurge," she replied, avoiding my eyes as she folded the clothes. I wanted to ask how she could afford it, but I held back. Confronting her in that moment felt premature, though the unease was growing heavier by the day. One night, as I worked late in the home office, I noticed her phone buzzing on the kitchen counter. It wasn't my intention to snoop, but the name flashing on the screen caught my attention. Unknown caller. Curiosity got the better of me, and I answered. "Hello?" There was a pause, then a man's voice. "Sarah? It's me. Are we still on for tomorrow?" My heart raced, and I struggled to keep my voice steady. "Who is this?" The line went dead. When Sarah returned from the bedroom, I handed her the phone. Someone called. Didn't leave a name. She stared at the screen, her expression unreadable, before forcing a laugh. "Probably a telemarketer. They've been relentless lately." Her explanation was flimsy at best, but I let it slide. I wasn't ready to confront her, not without concrete evidence. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind replayed every odd interaction, every suspicious moment. The late-night outings, the secretive phone calls, the expensive shopping. None of it added up. I decided it was time to stop giving her the benefit of the doubt. The following day, I made an appointment with my bank to review our joint accounts. As the banker scrolled through the statements, I felt my stomach drop. There were multiple large withdrawals over the past few months, all marked as personal expenses. "Do you recognize these transactions?" the banker asked, turning the screen toward me. I nodded, though my mind was racing. Sarah had access to our accounts, and it was clear she had been siphoning money for something, or someone. Later that evening, when Sarah left for another girls' night, I decided to dig deeper. I searched her drawers and found receipts for luxury purchases, trips to spas, and even a down payment on what appeared to be a luxury suite at an upscale hotel. The betrayal felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. I wanted to confront her right then and there, but something stopped me. If she had gone to such lengths to keep this hidden, I needed to play my cards carefully. The final straw came when I called her during one of her late nights out. The call went straight to voicemail, and I decided to drive to the restaurant she claimed to be at. When I arrived, I scanned the room, but there was no sign of her. Instead, I saw a woman who looked eerily like Gloria sitting at the bar, sipping a martini. I approached her, heart pounding. "Gloria?" She turned, her face lighting up in surprise before quickly masking it with a strained smile. "David, what are you doing here?" "I thought Sarah was meeting friends here," I said, my voice tight. Gloria hesitated, then glanced at her watch. "Oh, she must have left already. I'm just grabbing a drink before heading home." Her lie was obvious, and it only confirmed what I already suspected. Gloria was in on whatever Sarah was hiding. I left the restaurant, my thoughts swirling. Sarah had been lying to me for months, and now I had proof that her mother was complicit. The woman I had trusted, the woman I had vowed to share my life with, was plotting something behind my back. As I drove home, I resolved to uncover the full extent of her betrayal. I wasn't just suspicious anymore. I was determined. The weight of betrayal hung over me like a storm cloud, dark and oppressive. My suspicions about Sarah and Gloria's schemes grew stronger by the day, but I needed concrete proof before I could confront her. The opportunity came one evening when Sarah invited her mother over for dinner. The two of them retreated to the living room after eating, their voices low and conspiratorial. I lingered in the kitchen, pretending to clean up, but my focus was on their conversation. The murmurs turned into discernible words as Gloria's sharp tone cut through the air. "He's a liability, Sarah," Gloria said. "You've wasted enough time trying to make this work." "I know, Mom," Sarah replied, her voice tight with frustration, "but it's not as simple as you think. David isn't stupid. He started asking questions." "Then stop waiting," Gloria snapped. "After the dinner at La Vie Inn, you need to cut ties. Tell him it's over, and make sure you walk away with something." My grip tightened around the dishcloth in my hand. They were openly discussing how to discard me like yesterday's trash, as if my feelings and contributions meant nothing. It wasn't just a betrayal of trust. It was a calculated attempt to erase me from the life we had built together. I inched closer to the doorway, careful not to make a sound. Sarah sighed, her tone wavering. "But what if he fights back? David's not the kind of guy who'll just roll over." Gloria's laughter was cold and dismissive. "That's why you have to play it smart, darling. Make him look like the bad guy. If he doesn't cooperate, we'll make his life miserable." The audacity of their conversation was both infuriating and heartbreaking. I had given everything to Sarah, my love, my trust, my support, and this was how she repaid me? Gloria, the ever-present puppet master, was pulling the strings, but Sarah was just as complicit. I stepped back into the kitchen, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to barge into the living room and confront them both, but I knew it wasn't the right time. Their plan was already in motion, and if I acted rashly, they might find a way to twist the narrative against me. Instead, I took out my phone and hit record, capturing their voices as they continued to plot. "You deserve better, Sarah," Gloria said. "This is your chance to live the life you were meant to have." "I know," Sarah murmured, her resolve hardening. "After La Vie Inn, it's over." My stomach churned as I realized they intended to blindside me at the upcoming dinner. It wasn't just any dinner, it was a family gathering at one of the most expensive restaurants in town, A place I had agreed to book because Sarah insisted it was important. Now I understood why. By the time their conversation ended, I felt a strange mix of anger and clarity. The betrayal stung, but it also gave me the fuel I needed to fight back. For years, I had allowed Gloria's meddling and Sarah's dismissive behavior to chip away at my self-worth. But not anymore. I spent the rest of the evening strategizing. The recording on my phone was damning evidence, but I needed more. I called Mark, a trusted friend and lawyer, and explained the situation. "You need to protect yourself," Mark said firmly. "Document everything, financial transactions, communication logs, anything that shows a pattern of their behavior. If they're trying to frame you, you'll need proof to counter it." I spent the next few days gathering every piece of evidence I could find. Bank statements, credit card receipts, and Sarah's increasingly damning text messages all painted a clear picture of her duplicity. The more I uncovered, the more I realized how deeply Gloria had influenced her. On the night of the dinner, I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting my tie. My reflection stared back at me, resolute and unyielding. This wasn't just about proving a point. It was about reclaiming my dignity and ensuring they couldn't destroy my life. As I drove to La Vie Inn, I replayed their conversation in my head, reminding myself of what was at stake. I wasn't just walking into a trap. I was walking into their trap with my eyes wide open, ready to turn the tables. The upscale ambience of La Vie Inn was as elegant as I remembered, though tonight it felt like I was stepping onto a stage. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in a soft glow, and a string quartet played softly in the background. The scent of gourmet dishes wafted through the air as waiters glided between tables, balancing plates that looked more like works of art than food. But the opulence didn't calm me. It only reminded me of the facade Sarah and Gloria had built. When I arrived, Sarah and Gloria were already seated at the table. Sarah looked radiant in a designer dress I didn't recognize, and Gloria, as always, exuded an air of superiority. The sight of them almost made me laugh. Two people dressed for victory, unaware they were about to lose the game. "David, you're late," Gloria said. Her tone clipped as though she were addressing an employee, not her son-in-law. I offered a polite smile. Traffic was terrible. Sarah didn't meet my eyes as I sat down, her fingers fiddling nervously with her napkin. I recognized the signs. She was gearing up for something. Meanwhile, Gloria carried on with forced small talk, commenting on the restaurant's decor and how fitting it was for such an important evening. I played along, nodding and smiling, waiting for them to make their move. The waiter arrived with the wine list, and Gloria took charge, selecting the most expensive bottle without consulting me. I suppressed a smirk. Let them enjoy this moment, I thought. It'll be their last. As the meal progressed, the tension at the table grew palpable. Sarah barely touched her food, and Gloria's attempts at conversation became increasingly strained. I savored each bite, deliberately taking my time. I wanted them to stew in their own anticipation. When dessert arrived, Sarah finally spoke. Her voice was soft, almost apologetic, but her words were anything but. "David," she began, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "There's something I need to tell you." I set my fork down and looked at her, feigning confusion. "What is it?" She took a deep breath, glancing at Gloria for support. "I've been thinking a lot about our marriage, and I've come to the conclusion that it's not working anymore." I leaned back in my chair, giving her my full attention. "Go on." "I want a divorce," she said, her tone suddenly firmer. "I think it's for the best." Gloria chimed in, her voice dripping with condescension. "David, this isn't personal. It's just that Sarah deserves more excitement, more ambition, more everything." I let their words hang in the air for a moment before responding. "I see," I said slowly. "And this decision, when did you come to it?" Sarah hesitated. "It's been on my mind for a while." "And you decided this was the perfect venue to break the news? Over dessert, in a restaurant I paid for?" I asked, my voice calm but pointed. Gloria's smug expression faltered. "David, there's no need to be dramatic." "Dramatic?" I repeated, leaning forward. "You invited me here to humiliate me, and I'm the one being dramatic?" Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but Gloria remained defiant. It's not humiliation, it's honesty. Sarah deserves a fresh start, and so do you. I chuckled, shaking my head. You've got some nerve, Gloria, but I suppose it's fitting. You've been orchestrating this marriage from the start, haven't you? The color drained from Gloria's face. That's ridiculous. Is it? I asked, pulling my phone from my pocket. Because I have recordings that suggest otherwise. Their faces froze as I opened the audio file and hit play. Sarah's voice filled the air. He's holding us back, Mom. Followed by Gloria's sharp reply. You need to cut ties. Tell him it's over. The waiter passing by glanced at our table, sensing the rising tension. Sarah's eyes widened in horror, and Gloria's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. What are you doing? Sarah stammered. I'm showing you that I'm not the fool you think I am, I said evenly. You planned this, down to the dinner and the divorce announcement. But you didn't account for one thing. I was listening. Gloria recovered first, her tone venomous. You're being childish, David. No, Gloria, I said, standing up and tossing my napkin on the table. Childish would have been storming out without a plan, but I have a plan, and trust me, you won't like it. With that, I turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving them to face the bill for their luxurious betrayal. The waiter approached their table moments later, informing them the payment had been declined, thanks to the joint account I'd frozen earlier that day. As I stepped into the cool night air, I couldn't help but smile. The first move was mine, and the game had just begun. The following morning, I sat in my living room, sipping coffee and scrolling through my emails when the phone rang. It was Gloria, and I could already tell from the furious tone of her voice that last night's events at La Vienne hadn't gone well. You think this is funny? She spat before I could even say hello. The payment didn't go through. The restaurant manager humiliated us. Fix this now, David. I couldn't help but chuckle at her audacity. Fix this? After everything they'd done? Gloria, I said, keeping my voice steady, I don't think you understand. It's not my problem anymore. Remember? You and Sarah made it very clear that I'm no longer part of the family. Her silence was deafening, but I could practically hear the gears turning in her head. David, this is childish. Be reasonable. I set my mug down and leaned back in my chair, savoring the moment. Reasonable? Like you were when you schemed behind my back? Like Sarah was when she blindsided me with a divorce over dessert? I think I've been more than reasonable. Gloria sputtered something unintelligible before hanging up, no doubt realizing she wouldn't get anywhere with me. The call was a small victory, but the real win was knowing how much the unpaid bill had embarrassed them. La Vienne wasn't the kind of place that took kindly to financial mishaps, and I could only imagine the looks on their faces when they were asked to settle up without access to the funds they'd been counting on. But this was just the beginning. I spent the rest of the day reviewing the evidence I'd gathered, bank statements showing Sarah's unauthorized spending, receipts for her luxury purchases, and, of course, the recordings of her conversations with Gloria. I compiled everything into a neat folder and scheduled a meeting with my lawyer. It was time to take things to the next level. By freezing the joint accounts, I had already cut off their access to my hard-earned money. Now, I wanted to ensure they faced consequences for their actions. My lawyer, a sharp-witted woman named Helen, listened intently as I laid out the situation. This isn't just about the divorce, I said. It's about making sure they don't walk away thinking they can do this to someone else. Helen nodded. You've got a solid case here. With the evidence you've gathered, we can file for fraud and breach of marital trust. It'll strengthen your position during the divorce proceedings. Hearing her confidence was a relief. For months, I'd felt like I was drowning in their schemes, but now, for the first time, I felt like I had the upper hand. That evening, I received another call, this time from Sarah. Her tone was markedly different from Gloria's. Instead of anger, she sounded desperate. David, please. Let's talk. We can fix this. I let her words hang in the air for a moment before responding. Fix this? Sarah, you and your mother planned my exit from the beginning. What exactly is there to fix? She started to cry, but I wasn't moved. For years, I'd fallen for her tears, believing they were genuine. Now, I saw them for what they were, a tool to manipulate and control. David, I'm sorry. I made a mistake, she said between sobs. Please, I didn't mean for it to get this far. Save it, Sarah, I replied coldly. You and Gloria treated me like I was disposable. Now you're realizing that the life you planned doesn't work without me. She tried to argue, but I cut her off. You should have thought about the consequences before you decided to betray me. Now, you're going to have to live with them. I ended the call, feeling a mix of satisfaction and sadness. As much as I despised what Sarah and Gloria had done, a part of me still mourned the life we could have had, the life I thought we were building together. But I couldn't dwell on that anymore. I had to focus on the future. The next day, Helen filed the necessary paperwork, and the wheels of justice began to turn. Sarah and Gloria would soon find out that their actions had consequences far beyond an unpaid restaurant bill. As I sat down to dinner that night, the thought of them scrambling to cover their tracks brought a small smile to my face. They had underestimated me, and now they were paying the price. The day of the divorce proceedings felt like both a culmination and a beginning. As I stood outside the courthouse, I couldn't help but reflect on how far I'd come since Sarah blindsided me with her announcement at La Vienne. That dinner had marked the end of our marriage, but today marked the start of reclaiming my life. I walked into the courtroom prepared. Helen, my lawyer, had done an impeccable job assembling our case. On the other side of the room sat Sarah and Gloria, looking a bit less confident than usual. Gloria's usual smugness was muted, replaced by nervous glances and whispered conversations with their attorney. Sarah avoided eye contact altogether. Helen leaned over to me. "We've got this," she said, her voice calm and steady. I nodded, grateful for her assurance. The proceedings began, and as expected, their lawyer tried to paint me as controlling and emotionally detached. Mr. Wilson prioritized his work over his marriage, the lawyer claimed, gesturing dramatically. It's no wonder Sarah sought solace elsewhere. Helen stood up, calm as ever. Your Honor, let's focus on the facts. My client supported his wife financially throughout their marriage. He paid for her extravagant lifestyle, including luxury items and vacations, while she misused their joint accounts for personal gain. And let's not forget the prenuptial agreement. She handed a document to the judge. The mention of the prenup caused a noticeable shift in Sarah's demeanor. She had agreed to it reluctantly when we got married, dismissing it as a formality. But now, it was coming back to haunt her. The clause about infidelity, her idea of a joke back then, was the cornerstone of my case. Helen continued, presenting the evidence I'd gathered. Bank statements showing Sarah's reckless spending, recordings of her conspiring with Gloria, and proof of her affair. Each piece was like a nail in the coffin of their defense. When it was Sarah's turn to speak, she tried to sound remorseful. I never meant to hurt David, she said, her voice trembling. I made mistakes, but I still care about him. Her words rang hollow. The judge, a stern man with years of experience, looked unimpressed. Mrs. Wilson, he said, it's clear from the evidence that your actions were deliberate and deceptive. The court takes these matters seriously. The highlight of the day was when the judge addressed the infidelity clause in the prenup. As per the terms agreed upon by both parties, Mrs. Wilson is required to pay $50,000 to Mr. Wilson for breach of the agreement. Gloria's gasp echoed through the courtroom, and Sarah's face turned pale. For years, they had controlled the narrative, but now, the truth was undeniable. The court ruled in my favor, awarding me the compensation outlined in the prenup and ensuring that Sarah's financial games were put to an end. As we left the courtroom, Sarah approached me. David, she began, her voice low and desperate. Please, can we talk? I stopped and looked at her, the woman I had once loved but who had betrayed me in the worst way. There's nothing left to say, Sarah, I replied. You made your choices, and now you're facing the consequences. I hope you find what you're looking for, but it won't be at my expense anymore. She started to cry, but I turned away, walking out of the courthouse with my head held high. Helen caught up with me, a triumphant smile on her face. You handled that well, she said. Thanks to you, I replied. Now it's time to move on. That evening, I sat in my newly organized home, a glass of wine in hand. The weight of the day began to lift, replaced by a sense of closure. The divorce wasn't just the end of my marriage. It was the end of the toxic influence Sarah and Gloria had on my life. For the first time in years, I felt free. The first morning after the divorce felt different. There was no bitterness, no lingering anger, just quiet, peaceful solitude. I brewed a cup of coffee and stared out of the kitchen window, watching the sunlight dance on the leaves of the tree outside. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the weight of someone else's expectations or criticisms bearing down on me. It was just me, my thoughts, and the possibilities ahead. My first task was to rebuild the life I had put on hold. My career had always been stable, but during my marriage, I had turned down opportunities to grow. Sarah had insisted I focus on predictable paths that wouldn't disrupt her lifestyle. With her gone, I finally had the freedom to explore new ventures. I reached out to a former colleague, Jason, who had often invited me to collaborate on a tech startup he was passionate about. "David," he exclaimed when I called, "it's about time. I was starting to think you'd forgotten about me." "Never," I replied. "I was just distracted. But now, I'm ready." We met the next day to discuss his project. Jason's enthusiasm was infectious, and I couldn't help but feel a spark of excitement. The idea of diving into something innovative and challenging reignited a fire in me that I thought had been extinguished. Within weeks, I joined his team, throwing myself into the work with a focus and energy I hadn't felt in years. Outside of work, I began reconnecting with friends I had lost touch with during my marriage. Sarah had always found excuses to keep me away from them, subtly implying that they weren't worth my time. Now, I realized how much I had missed those connections. My friend group welcomed me back with open arms, and soon, my evenings were filled with laughter and stories instead of silence. I also started exploring new hobbies, things I had always been curious about but never pursued. Cooking classes became a surprising favorite. I found joy in creating something from scratch, experimenting with flavors and techniques. It was therapeutic, a reminder that life could be simple and rewarding without the complications of toxic relationships. The house, which had once felt like a battlefield, slowly transformed into a sanctuary. I redecorated, replacing the furniture Sarah had chosen with pieces that reflected my style. I painted the walls, added personal touches, and created a space that felt uniquely mine. Every change was a step toward reclaiming my independence and identity. Occasionally, whispers of Sarah and Gloria's ongoing dramas reached me. A mutual acquaintance mentioned that Gloria was struggling to maintain her lavish lifestyle now that Sarah was financially strained. Sarah, it seemed, was trying to mend fences with her mother, but their relationship had always been transactional. Without money to fuel it, their bond was crumbling. Surprisingly, I felt no satisfaction in their downfall, only indifference. Their chaos was no longer mine to bear, and that realization brought me peace. One evening, as I sat on my newly furnished balcony, watching the sunset with a glass of wine in hand, I reflected on how far I'd come. The betrayal and pain that once consumed me had become lessons, harsh ones, but lessons nonetheless. They taught me the value of self-respect, the importance of boundaries, and the strength I had within me. A few weeks later, Jason's startup secured its first major investor. The celebration was small but heartfelt, and as I stood among my colleagues, I realized I wasn't just moving on, I was thriving. My life wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and that was more than enough. Months passed, and the rhythm of my new life settled into something steady and fulfilling. The days of betrayal and bitterness felt like a distant memory, replaced by moments of genuine contentment. But closure, true closure, doesn't come from the passing of time. It comes from facing the past and accepting it for what it is. It was a Saturday morning when I overheard two strangers chatting at the local coffee shop. One of them mentioned Gloria and Sarah. My ears perked up instinctively, though I didn't want to admit I still had a lingering curiosity about their fate. "They're at it again," one of them said with a chuckle. "Fighting over money. Can't seem to keep their hands off each other's wallets." I didn't approach them. I didn't need to. Their words confirmed what I had already suspected. The cycle of toxicity between Gloria and Sarah hadn't changed. They had simply redirected their manipulative tendencies inward, turning on each other now that I was no longer their target. For a brief moment, I felt a pang of something, a mixture of pity and relief. I pitied them for being trapped in their own greed, but I felt overwhelming relief that their chaos was no longer my burden to carry. I paid for my coffee and left without looking back. As I walked through the park, the crisp autumn air filled my lungs, and I realized how far I'd come. My life wasn't defined by their betrayal anymore. It was defined by the choices I had made afterward, choices that led me to this newfound peace. Later that evening, I sat down with my journal. Writing had become a therapeutic outlet for me, a way to process my thoughts and emotions. I wrote about the past year, the pain, the anger, the moments of doubt, and how it had all shaped me into someone stronger. For the first time, I didn't feel like a victim of Sarah and Gloria's manipulation. I felt like a survivor, someone who had taken control of his life and emerged on the other side with dignity intact. I thought about the man I was before the marriage, the one who ignored red flags, who sacrificed his own happiness to appease others, who let love blind him to reality. That man was gone. In his place was someone who understood his worth, someone who wouldn't settle for less than respect and loyalty. The next day, I received a call from Jason. The startup we had poured our hearts into was thriving, and he wanted to celebrate. "You've been instrumental in this, David," he said. "Let's take a moment to enjoy it." As we clinked glasses that evening, I realized that success wasn't just about career achievements. It was about reclaiming my identity, rebuilding my confidence, and finding joy in the simple things. The people around me now, colleagues, friends, and neighbors, were genuine and supportive. There was no ulterior motive, no undercurrent of manipulation. It was a stark contrast to the life I had left behind. The final piece of closure came unexpectedly. While cleaning out some old files, I stumbled upon photos from the early days of my marriage to Sarah. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should throw them away. But instead, I flipped through them, allowing myself to feel the emotions they brought up. There were moments of happiness, no matter how fleeting. But there were also shadows, small, overlooked signs of the storm that would eventually come. I kept one photo, a picture of me standing alone, smiling in front of a mountain landscape during one of our vacations. I wasn't smiling for Sarah or anyone else in that moment. It was for me. I framed it and placed it on my desk as a reminder of who I was and who I had become. As I turned off the lights that night and lay in bed, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in years. The betrayal, the divorce, and the humiliation were scars, but they didn't define me. They were reminders of a journey I had survived and grown from. My story wasn't just about loss. It was about resilience, self-discovery, and the strength to start anew. And with that, I closed the chapter on Sarah and Gloria, knowing my life was finally my own.